And now, decades after that point, Russia has gained mass influence in the Cold War, and much of that power it still holds today. So thus, with Russia holding all this power both domestically and across the entire world, it becomes crucial to ask this question. What effect will Russia's growing global influence have on global human rights? The answer comes in three forms. One, it will mean less human rights in Russia itself. Two, it will mean less human rights as they support dictators in the Middle East. And three, it could lead to proxy wars between Russia and China and Iran and Saudi Arabia. But let's begin with the first point of analysis and talk about Russia domestically. Now, perhaps it would be a bit hokey, a little bit too goody two-shoes American for me to say that America is a beacon of democracy and those Reds over there don't know what they're doing, though it's kind of true. What is true is that Russia does not practice democracy in quite the same way as the United States does. As the Business Insider reports on January the 5th, 2018, the current Russian presidential election is mainly a scam, just to put Mr. Putin back in power. And power is what he needs as he expands Russia's global reach. And as a result of this, all of the candidates running against Mr. Putin or for other elected positions are either allies to Mr. Putin or people who aren't going to get into his way. There was, though, one key exception, a politician named Alexei Navalny. As the Wall Street Journal reports on August 17, 2017, Alexei Navalny was actually arrested by the Russian government for protesting against Mr. Putin. And now, he's been excluded from the Russian election itself. It is illegal for him to run, though he has a strong following amongst many young people in Russia. What we see here is that Mr. Putin is manipulating the electoral schematisms in Russia just to put himself in power, limiting the democratic values that exist in Russia in almost every capacity. Now, you could easily argue that we're actually talking about global rights, not just about Russia. But I would counter, saying that it would be misguided to exclude Russia, the biggest nation on the planet, when talking about global human rights. Moreover, this democratic manipulation is happening as a result of Mr. Putin needing to consolidate all the power he can to ensure his global overreach. But let's go to the second point of analysis to look at that overreach itself and see why Russia is expanding its global influence and is actually supporting many dictators in the Middle East. Let's begin with Turkey. Now, hopes for democracy in the Middle East were rising day by day a few months ago when there was a military coup, held in Turkey that sought to overthrow Erdogan. But then those hopes were quickly squashed. Erdogan cracked down on the revolt, and the democratic values, any that existed in Turkey previously, evaporated almost instantaneously. As the New York Times reports on September the 9th, 2017, the prisons in Turkey became so overcrowded with journalists and college professors and other intellectuals that Turkey had to start releasing, actual criminals like robbers and other felons. Evidently, intellectuals have become more dangerous to Erdogan than actual felons. And just to show you that Russia and Turkey are in cahoots in the Middle East, as the Wall Street Journal reports on January the 25th, 2018, they recently combinationally attacked an envoy of Kurdish Peshmerga forces in Iraq, together with Russian soldiers right beside Turkish ones. So this proves that they are combining their own forces to exert more influence in the Middle East. But let's look at another heinous dictatorship that Russia has supported in Syria, Bashar al-Assad. Now, I was debating a few days ago with Kevin Spiraki, who does Congress, about how Bashar al-Assad, bad as he may be as a dictator and as autocratic he may be, he could actually bring stability to Syria. But let's just say this, we're not talking about stability, we're talking about human rights. And the kind of dictator who fires the first shot in a civil war against the citizens he purports to defend is no defender of human rights. And as Vox reported on January the 15th, 2018, Russia has repeatedly, again and again, funneled weapons and supplies to Bashar al-Assad's forces in Syria, guaranteeing that he will remain, for as far as we can see, the dictator in Syria. Thus we see that in two of the biggest Middle Eastern countries, Russia is supporting dictatorships that routinely, as a matter of course, violate human rights at the most basic levels. But let's look at the Middle East in an even deeper sense and look at its alliance with Saudi Arabia. Now, this is perhaps the most circuitous part of the argument. But let's just look at China for a moment. China has been doing something very similar to what Russia has been doing in almost every major way, only their influence is in Asia and neighboring Asian countries, with one key exception. As the New York Times reports on January the 11th, 2018, China is supporting Iran in the Middle East, channeling funds and diplomatic support in any way they can, just to get a foothold in the Middle East. Russia is using the same tactic against Saudi Arabia. Just as the Business Insider reported on January the 6th, 2018, Saudi Arabia just pledged $10 billion of investment in Russian energy, proving that they are forming an alliance as we speak. And here's where the conflict comes in. Saudi Arabia and Iran are sworn enemies in the Middle East. On almost every major issue, they are at opposing ends because they are warring with each other in proxy wars to get more and more influence in the Middle East. Already in the fight against ISIS, when troops and civilization moves back into the places that were dominated by ISIS, they are feuding over territory and influence. And what this means is that Russia, acting behind Saudi Arabia, and China, acting behind Iran, could get into territorial disputes and influence disputes in the Middle East, meaning that there could be other forms of proxy warfare in the Middle East. And I don't even need to describe all of the human rights violations that take place on a battlefield. So thus, when we return to the question, we find that the answer is that Russia will affect human rights in almost every way detrimentally. Decades ago, Winston Churchill said that in Eastern Europe, Russia cast an iron curtain over the rest of Europe, forcing all those countries under communist rule. That was clearly evident. But now, even after it was supposedly lifted in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, the influence still remains. There's still an iron curtain, but it's just not visible. It just becomes so disguised that many people can't see it. But it doesn't mean there's not a barrier.